Isidore Isaac Rabi, a Nobel Prize winner in physics and one of the developers of the atomic bomb, was once asked how he became a scientist. Rabi replied that every day after school, his mother would talk to him about his school day. She wasn't so much interested in what he had learned that day, but how he conducted himself in his studies. She always inquired, "Did you ask a good question today?" Asking a good question, Rabi said, made me become a scientist. In order to ask a good question, I think you need to have noble motives behind the question. You have to want to know the truth. The Pharisees, by contrast, already had the answers to their questions. They felt they already knew the truth. How many times have we had it in for someone and ask a question designed to trap them? We do it to our loved ones all the time. When we do this, we are not trying to learn, we are trying to endure. The Pharisees come to Jesus once again with a question designed to do damage to the reputation of Jesus. And once again, Jesus proves he is equal to the task. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Now, even though this question was used to test Jesus, it is nonetheless an important question. Perhaps in the life of Israel at that time, it was the most important question. But Jesus had a question of his own, a question which signified that the times were changing. A new theological season had come. He put this question to the same Pharisees who had tested him. "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" These were the two most important questions of that era. And my friends, they are the two most important questions of our time. Let us consider first, which law is the greatest? Since the dawn of the written word, I guess mankind has looked for ways to summarize his thoughts. So it's not surprising that during Jesus' time, the Bible experts known as the Pharisees looked for a way to summarize the teachings of Moses and the prophets. Today, the Christians simply call these writings the Old Testament. So, how do you summarize the Old Testament? Sounds like an impossible task. Consider what it entails. There are 46 books in the Old Testament. These books, Genesis to Malachi, were written over 1,500 years period. They describe events which occurred over 2,000 years of history. There are at least 30 different authors and quite possibly far more than just 30. The books contain many forms of literature, history, poetry, songs, prophecy, wisdom, and story form. And the list of characters and events is staggering. It is the book of an ancient people. Now, how in the world do you summarize such a collection? Can it really be done? Jesus seems to indicate that it can, when he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. First, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, it might surprise you to learn that Jesus was not the first person to bring these two commandments together as a summary. Others had already done this. If you look at the teaching in Luke, you will see that it is the lawyer who summarizes the law in this way, and not Jesus. So this is not unique to Jesus. What is significant here is Jesus' small but powerful statement at the end. He says, all the law, that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the prophets, that's most of the rest of the Old Testament, hang on these two commandments. It is interesting to interject at this point a little background. The Jewish rabbis of Jesus' time had meticulously gone through the first 5 books of the Bible and identified 613 individual statutes in the law. Then they took these hundreds of commands and attempted to identify which were great commands and which were little commands. Now, you can well imagine that there was no end of debate on which belonged where. And these lawyers who come to Jesus are attempting to draw him into a debate. Which is the greatest? They ask. There is something within us that wants to be told what to do rather than how to be. There would have been a certain satisfaction in knowing exactly those things we must do to fulfill the law. But there is a danger here. The law confines us and makes us judgmental of others. If on the other hand, we are guided to love, then there is freedom because love is based on relationship. One of my friends once told me about a prayer his mother used to say every day during their family prayer for him. He told me that she would put her hands on me and say, "Oh God, take this boy of mine and make him the boy and man he is divinely designed to be." Then she would bend over and kiss me and leave me alone in the silence with God. Now that's creative love. You see, law is not enough. Law tells us what we have done wrong. Love tells us who we can be. Over these 613 statutes of the law stands these 2 obligations in our relationship with Yahweh. Love God and love your neighbor. We can be left alone with the law or we can be left alone with God. I chose to be left alone with God. Now let us consider the second question. The experts of the law asked the first, and while their motives were not pure, their question is important. Which is the greatest commandment? Now it's their turn to answer a question. Jesus asked the second question, and let me admit upfront that this is very confusing. Without going into a lot of detail, the question Jesus is asking the lawyers can be paraphrased this way. Who is the Messiah's father? Or it can be phrased this way. Is the father of the Messiah David or God? Is the Christ a descendant of David only, or is he, more importantly, the Son of God? To lend support to the notion that the Messiah was not just a man whose genealogy traced back to King David, but was first and foremost the Son of God, Jesus quotes Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord. Jewish teachings had maintained that this line referred to the Messiah. Jesus is saying that the Messiah is not just a descendant of David, but is the Lord of King David. The point is, even David himself recognized this by calling him Lord. I told you it was confusing. If you get lost in the argument, don't be disappointed. Even the experts in the law walked away from this one, and scriptures tell us they dared not ask him any more questions. But the point is this: the Messiah is the Son of God, not just King David's great-great-great-great-grandson. This is about the identity of Jesus. A few years ago, there was a rather mind-boggling announcement made. There has been a lot of really bad news lately, so I was deeply moved by this piece of good news. Perhaps you heard that an ossuary, a burial box for bones, was discovered in Israel. The limestone box is from the 1st century. An inscription on its side in the Aramaic language reads, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." The ossuary has been thoroughly reviewed by scientists and archaeological experts, and they have concluded it is very probable that this is the actual burial crypt for the remains of Jesus' brother James. In the book of Acts, James was the first leader of the early church. What is so breathtaking about this artifact is it's the only reference to Jesus from the first century. Prior to this, there was nothing. The earliest reference to Jesus was a fragment of John's Gospel from 125 AD. This ossuary is dated to 63 AD, just 30 years after Jesus' death. This is the closest we have gotten to the historical Jesus. What an incredible find! James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That's what the box says. But that is only half the story. The other half is found in Jesus' cryptic question. What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? Let me ask you that question. What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? Is he the son of Joseph, the brother of James? Or more importantly, is he the Son of God and brother of all mankind? Answer this question and you will be empowered to love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Amen.